Welcome back. It's quite the marathon, isn't it? Physical and intellectual, but it's all very good. And we're grateful for your participation and look forward to your even more active participation and engagement tomorrow in the think tank sessions. Do connect with us, and although we have a lot of people here, I think a lot of people outside will benefit from the conversation. So whatever you can do to amplify that, that's most appreciated and will certainly contribute to the success and the visibility and the impact of the Victoria Forum. We're back for a session on new partnerships for inclusion and development. And to introduce that session, I'd invite Nora McRae, Director for the Office of Community Engagement, to introduce the panel. Nora.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our afternoon session, New Partnerships for Inclusion and Development. And as indicated, my name is Nora McRae. I'm the Executive Director for the Cooperative Education and Career Services and the Director of the Office of Community University Engagement here at UVic. I'm so pleased to be here with you today and to have the opportunity to provide a brief snapshot of UVic's partnership initiatives before introducing the moderator for this session. Last year, we started tracking UVic's community engagement initiatives on an interactive online map, which you can see on the screen behind me. Each of the initiatives represented in the map involve a partnership or connection between UVic and our external community. And the size of the bubble indicates the number of partnerships. To date, we have close to 1,300 unique initiatives in the map that include connections in over 80 countries. This map can be filtered on a number of categories, initiatives or partnerships that involve Indigenous community, location, discipline, and themes. They're incredibly diverse and include everything from community-engaged research projects, MOUs, exchange agreements, public lecture series, and community-engaged learning experiences for our students, which include activities such as co-op work terms, field schools, practica, for example. We know we've just scratched the surface of the community partnerships and projects that UVic faculty, staff, and students are engaged with, but this map is beginning to showcase the breadth, reach, and positive impact that our partnerships do and can have in Canada and across the world. Let's imagine for a second if we were to take this a step further and map all of the partnerships represented amongst each and every one of us in this room today. How many extraordinary connections would it showcase? How many further collaborations could be cultivated by recognizing the way we already connect to make positive change and collective impact? How smart would that be? I'm continually encouraged by the difference that these projects are making in the world, and I wish I could share a few examples with you, but I only have a few minutes. So I invite you to go online after this session and explore. Thank you all for being here. I think this conference is an amazing example of what can happen when we partner together. And a special thanks to the conference organizers, Global Affairs Canada and UVic, and to the many partner organizations that have supported the conference vision. And it is now my great pleasure to introduce the moderator for this afternoon's session. Hilary Pearson is president of Philanthropic Foundations Canada, a national network of family, independent, and corporate grant makers in Canada, representing many of the largest private charitable foundations in the country. Since her 2001 appointment as president, she has grown the organization to become a significant voice in Canadian organized philanthropy. She has a background in all three sectors, with positions in central agencies of the Government of Canada from 1981 to 1993, and an executive role for the Royal Bank of Canada from 1993 to 1996, and a senior consultant at the Montreal strategy consulting firm Secor from 1993 to 2001. Ms. Pearson has a particular interest in nonprofit governance and has served on several national nonprofit boards of directors, including those of Imagine Canada, the Stratford Shakespeare Festival of Canada, Care Canada, and Inspire. She also chairs the advisory body of the Coady Institute at St. Francis Xavier University. Ms. Pearson holds a BA and MA from the University of Toronto and honorary doctorates from Carleton University, and the University of New Brunswick. So please join me in welcoming today's panel moderator, Hilary Pearson.
Thank you very much, Nora. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, actually, for coming back from lunch. It's a little hard to see you through the lights here, but I can see that there are some of you out there, and I appreciate that. And I think my fellow panelists here appreciate your continuing interest in exploring this topic of inclusion and diversity from the lens that we are going to be exploring it, which is the lens of partnership. We are going to, I want to explain a little bit about the format here, and then I'm going to introduce our two panelists. We would like to encourage a conversation. So we are going to have a conversation amongst ourselves initially. And then we very much want to have some input from the audience. I think we enjoy the opportunity to go back and forth with you. And so if there is a question that you want to ask, please do ask. We are going to make sure we have room for that. And ideally, we'd be able to come back and forth with you, not only answer the question, but also build on some of the themes that we're going to be discussing and that I'm sure you can add to. We have an hour, so we're going to respect that. And, we will have to, unfortunately, cut off questions if there are enough. That would be wonderful. But we want to make sure that we stick to our hour. And so we'll cut off about 5 minutes before the hour and conclude with some closing statements from our two panelists. So I'm going to introduce the two of them, and I'm also going to take advantage of having the microphone to talk a little bit about philanthropy, since that hasn't really come up yet at this conference. And I think it's an important one. It's one of the tracks, philanthropy and civil society, and our role in promoting inclusion and diversity, or in dealing with the challenges of inclusion and diversity. So, first of all, let me introduce the two panelists, and I'm very pleased that both of them accepted my invitation to come and be on this panel. Dr. ELISSAR SARROUH, to my immediate left, is the founder and CEO of Expert Consulting on Governance, which is an organization based in Ottawa. And she's also a professor of practice at the Institute for the Study of International Development at McGill University. And before that, ELISSAR had a long career at the United Nations, and I think she has a particular perspective on global partnerships that she's going to bring to this conversation. And to my far left is Doug HORSWILL, who actually I had the pleasure of knowing way back when he and I both worked in the federal government. His most recent position was Senior Vice President, Sustainability and External Affairs at Teck Resources, and he's now based in Vancouver. But he spent many years in the public service, both at the federal level and in the province of British Columbia, where he served as Deputy Minister of Finance and Corporate Relations and Deputy Minister of Energy, Mines and Petroleum Resources. So both of our panelists have deep experience in partnerships, in thinking about partnerships and working across sectors, and we're going to be exploring that theme a little bit. But before I start to ask them some hopefully challenging questions, I just want to spend a bit of time, 5 minutes, talking about what is happening in philanthropy in Canada. As Norah mentioned, I'm the leader of a network, Philanthropic Foundations Canada, which is a network of grant makers. And by that we mean foundations, but these are grant-making foundations, not fundraising foundations. So these are the foundations that provide support to many nonprofits, charities across the country. Also corporate giving programs, so we're not exclusive to foundations in spite of our name. And there has been a very significant development in philanthropy in Canada over the last decade. A strong growth in the foundation sector, or in fact in institutional philanthropy generally. So more money, more assets going into the sector, and an important increase in organizations that are strategically focused. So grant makers that are thinking very hard about the work that they do and the kind of impact that they want to have. And there is more focus on social change. So grant making is not just about writing a check to the University of Victoria, good as that is, and important as that is, but really about how to change systems. So there is, I think, in that interest in change, also an increasing interest in partnership, because no foundation, no donor can do this alone. You all know, any of you who are involved in social change, that it is complex, it's messy, it's difficult, and it does require collaboration. So foundations are looking increasingly at partnership and as a tool for transformation of systems. But there is a disconnect, and this is true across the world. It's true in Canada as well. There's a disconnect between transformative social change and the availability of transformative funding and expertise. And by that I mean that the social change leaders that are out there are not finding the funders that they need, who are prepared to fund them in the way that they need to be funded to really achieve change at scale. So this is something that funders are struggling with. Foundations can provide money, but they can provide much more than money. And in engaging in partnership, I think they have to think about that. Can they provide connections? Can they convene? Can they provide their expertise? Can they provide voice? Or can they support the voice and the raising of voice by their partners? These are important ideas that foundations are exploring increasingly, and I wanted to underline them because I think as we start to talk about partnerships, I think there are a number of foundations in Canada that we can now point to as being very thoughtful and strategic partners. Now, there is a tension in any partnership, and I think this will be illustrated shortly in the stories that I'm going to ask Doug and ELISSAR to tell about partnership. There are tensions that come from imbalances of power. Foundations and funders have money, and typically the organizations they're working with don't, and that immediately creates a tension, which has to be addressed. It has to be voiced, and it has to be addressed in some way. There's always the question of who leads and who follows. There's the question of how to communicate in a partnership, and communication can be very, very difficult if it's not done properly. So with those ideas, I'd like to turn now to ELISSAR first. And I'd like to go also from the local to the global. As I mentioned, ELISSAR has a background at the United Nations. And in that position, she has had some experience with partnerships across the world. And she's also, she has a perspective on the way in which the United Nations is now looking globally at the development of countries across the world and how partnerships can play a role in that development. So, ELISSAR, do you want to talk a bit about how you see partnerships in a global context?
Thank you, Hilary. It's a pleasure to be here and join this discussion. To talk about partnerships and what effective partnerships mean in addressing the challenges that we are facing today, I'd like to just talk about the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals that the whole world is committed to deliver by 2030, and the values that are underlying this agenda, that vows that to leave no one behind, which has become a guiding principle for all the development agencies and donors and countries to try to develop plans and strategies to ensure that we reach all, regardless of religion, of race, of ethnicity, geographical location, anywhere in the world. No one should be left behind. So that's really a laudable and also lauded agenda that the world had committed to address the issues of inequalities, the issue of poverty, and how we embrace inclusiveness in this development agenda. And a key or corner or a pillar in this process that brought us to this Agenda 2030 was a consultation that took place and led by the United Nations to try to come up and consult on how should this post-2015 agenda looks like, And this is what brought us the 2030 agenda, which the messages from this global consultation that took all over the world, that was a very clear message that the next development paradigm and agenda should be based on human rights, should be based on inclusiveness, should recognize diversity, and should have an inclusive governance model that brings us all into responsibility on delivering a better world for all. And that's what the 16 Sustainable Development Goals embodies. Now, how are we going to really deliver this agenda? The recent, the 2017 World Bank World Development Report also stressed and emphasized that in order to deliver the 2030 agenda, we need to look at how the new development agenda within the context of inclusive governance. There was a whole debate and work done on what do we mean by inclusive governance and the rule of law in the context of delivering the 2030. I'm bringing all that to reach the where we are concerned with now is that Canada, as recent last May, has issued a new international aid policy, which it's a feminist aid international policy, which was embraced by the whole world as a leadership of Canada on coming on a bold agenda to try to deliver aid and address the 2030 agenda. The policy addresses very clearly that to address issues of poverty and power asymmetries, as Hillary pointed out, is to take approach of gender equality and women empowerment as the framework of delivering this new aid policy. And there's a number of other core areas that were outlined. Of them, I would mention, again, inclusive governance, human rights, dignity, a system or economic policies that work for all, etc. These are very ambitious agendas and development for the next 2015 that was outlined, and the whole world has committed to deliver, including Canada. So how are we going to really deliver this ambitious agenda to address the inequalities, to address the issues of poverty and inclusiveness that we face the whole world, taking into consideration the whole changes that we are living today and witnessing as a global actors in this, in delivering this agenda. So partnerships become a very important and serious commitment that we have to all together commit to. And throughout the discussion today, we're going to talk about some experiences that we think that might, deliver some of what we have committed to do.
Thank you very much. Doug, you've been involved, particularly in the corporate world, you've been involved in a certain number of partnerships, bringing it back to perhaps more of a local lens, as not a global but a local lens. You have been involved in a number of partnerships.
Right.
And it'd be interesting to hear your take on what has worked in these partnerships.
Okay. Yes, I was asked to bring the kind of private business or corporate perspective to this discussion. I guess I'd just add my thanks to Chief Thomas and Chief Sam for having us here on Esquimalt and Songhees territory. What I want to do is talk about, within the context of Hillary's question, harnessing the capacity of the private business sector in pursuit of the goals of making the world a better place. You all can define that for yourself. To think about how we broaden the goals to ensure that not only the pace of economic growth, but its pattern are considered in the outcomes. And to think about how collaboration to be able to ensure that various different points of view are brought to the table are considered. And I want to talk about briefly, if I can, three different things. A partnership called Zinc and Health, that Teck developed. The Red Dog Mine, which is located in northwest Alaska, partnership between Teck and the Inupiat people living in that area. And then some experiences I had on the panel looking at the expert panel reviewing Canadian environmental assessment legislation on behalf of Minister McKenna. I want to start off quickly, though, talking about how I think views have evolved over the years. And I'll do that by reaching back into the time when I left the government of BC and joined a company called Cominco then. Now it's part of Teck. An old salt ran it. His name was Bob Hallbauer, and he was a very impressive titan of the mining industry. My first meeting with him, which I anticipated to be 20 minutes long, lasted 4 hours because he just wanted to talk to me. And as I left, and he had offered me the job and I had taken it, he said, the future of our industry depends on making friends with Aboriginal people. And this was back in 1992. It wasn't fashionable, nor was it kind of part of the political discourse of the day, but he saw it as an absolutely essential element in an industry that deals with resources. So it was interesting to notice that around him, people hadn't caught up to him, but that's where his view was. What I discovered in the company, though, was an undercurrent of values that you could build on to drive sustainability concepts. And indeed, we accomplished that in the company. Zinc and Health is a program that Don Lindsay, the now CEO, and I conceived of. Actually, it was over dinner in Townsville, Australia that it got started. We started to learn how important zinc was to agricultural health and human health, how stunting in Africa was largely a result of the lack of zinc in the nutrition for young children. And if they didn't get that by the age of 2, they would never recover. The other element that came even more importantly to us was the impact of diarrhea. About 1.9 million children under 5 a year were dying of diarrhea at that time. And the treatment was simple. The treatment was oral rehydration salts plus zinc. Cost somewhere between 10 and 50 cents per child. That would save their lives. And I mean, here we think of diarrhea as an inconvenience. There, children were getting 10 bouts a year and dying rapidly as a consequence of the aftermath. So we started surveying around the federal government and trying to get an interest in government on this topic. Ultimately connected up with Micronutrient Initiative. Ended up with a 3-way partnership between Canada, MI, and Teck, and launched the first round of a $5 million program in 4 countries in sub-Saharan Africa that probably affected 100,000 children now. That led through something called the Clinton Initiative to an identification of this, and it brought us together with UNICEF that led to another partnership in 4 states in India, a connection with a German chemical company called BASF, and that led to us getting involved in fortification of all food with zinc, which has impacted probably 100 million people in the world now. So from a very small beginning, a set of partnerships that grew and extended in their own way has had an enormous effect on humanity in places of true need in this world. That's a case of corporate philanthropy in the main, and we can go over it a little more later. The Red Dog Mine is it's either the biggest or the second largest zinc mine in the world, just depending on production in a particular year. It was discovered in the late 70s after a lot of different types of conflict. Ultimately, an agreement was signed between old Cominco and NANA, the political entity that controls that territory. It was a traditional territory in 1982, and it led to Cominco spending about $350 million in those days to start the mine, and probably $1 billion so far of capital invested. It's led to a situation where NANA, a community of 11,000 people, have received something in the order of $1 billion, a portion of which they've shared with other Alaska Native corporations. 60% of the workforce is now NANA. Significant numbers of young people have been educated, have gone through scholarship programs, and it's lasted 30 years based on key elements of mutual respect, building trust, and finding transparent means to solve problems. And it's a partnership that has exceeded all expectations in terms of the benefits to both sides. And lastly, my experience on the expert panel with SIA. We've heard a lot in the last 2 days from Indigenous people and the struggles. We traveled to 30 communities, spent 110 days of hearings, coast to coast to coast, and repeatedly we heard very, very hard, difficult stories of loss of land, loss of rights, trampled on rights, how badly Indigenous people have been treated. And we were dealing with an issue with land, and of course we've heard of the spirituality and the importance of land. One non-Aboriginal person in Halifax said to us, the problem is Canadians don't know their own history, and we've heard that repeated over and over here today. You know, and inclusiveness really requires that, because you can see the devastation that's occurred in this country socially and otherwise as a consequence. The city where, the town, the area that it became most apparent was in Fort St. John, the BC portion of Treaty 8. Of course, when it started, it was undisturbed. Now, probably 84 to 88% of the territory covered by Treaty 8 and the bands, the Prophet River and Doig River, and a couple of other bands in that area are suffering, 84%. And I was thinking as I listened to the presentation there, and seeing the serious damage. Back in the late 80s, I was Deputy Minister of Energy Mines, and under me was the group that actually dispensed licenses for natural gas drilling. And I'm ashamed to say, at that time, the drilling pads and the roads and all of the approvals were made, and there wasn't 1 ounce of consideration of the impact on Aboriginal people and Aboriginal rights. Today, that's not the case. That part of history has erased, and I think we've all moved on, me included. But it was interesting to watch. The other thing that happened there, 2 young ladies, 2 young women from one of the local bands, I think it was Blueberry, made a presentation to us that was just profound, and it was typical of what we were seeing from coast to coast to coast, of young Aboriginal youth, Indigenous youth, very educated, very committed, and very informed. And what it gave all of us on that panel was great hope that an inclusive future that brought that segment of our society to the table in meaningful ways was going to lead to a positive result at the end of the day.
Great, thank you very much. Interesting stories. ELISSAR, I want to come back to you and ask a question about inclusive governance. It's clearly a critical factor in successful partnerships for development. Do you want to elaborate a bit on what you mean by, or what you see as inclusive governance? What are the factors involved in inclusive governance? How do you get at some of the questions of the power imbalances in partnerships?
Yeah, the inclusive governance is not really a new concept, but there's the emphasis on it right now is to try to see how we're going to really address the issues of poverty, the issues of inequalities, and inequalities not just in the terms between individuals, but also between countries and areas that are suffering or are at the lowest scale of development. So inclusive governance, the term inclusive is to express that, to bring everybody, as the Agenda 2030 is advocating, to leave no one behind. And in order to leave no one behind, we have to really have the right institutions and mechanisms and policies and processes to try to reach to everyone, everywhere, and anyone. So the concept is that we have in place parliaments that are effective, that represent their constituencies. We have a bureaucracy of public institutions that are responsive, that they're accountable, that they are transparent, that citizens are empowered and informed so that they can engage with public institutions, with their representatives to try to bring their priorities into the agenda setting, into the policy-making process. Canada has a history and leadership in the development its strategy in the past and now in the new feminist international aid policy. It's not new to Canada to promote gender equality. We've been always supporting women leadership and gender equality. But what is new in this particular is that we are advocating, or we are committing to deliver our international aid assistance within a framework of gender equality and women empowerment. So now that's leadership. And the Honorable Minister, when she announced the strategy, and there was some concern about lack of resources that were allocated to deliver the policy, her response was, Canada is asked for leadership. People want to see us around the table and really bring forward our progressive values. And that's very true. But at the same time, how are we going to really deliver this very ambitious aid policy, international aid policy? And this is what really brings the issue of partnerships. In this particular, policy that we have, it's not just the issue where do we get the resources. Of course, it's a very important question, because the estimate for the 15 SDGs, 16 SDGs, and the agenda to deliver in the next 15 years, the estimate for that is some $7 trillion. Where is this money going to come from? Especially, in the areas we are suffering from poverty, from, diseases, from natural disasters. Where is this money coming from, or would come from? It would come from partnerships and new thinking and fresh ideas. How are we going to partner with different stakeholders around the world, in Canada and our partners, but not just in terms of partnership for resources, partnership to really advance this vision and this policy that says equality can be addressed, and equality, economic policies and development can be achieved if we pursue, or if we really adopt a framework of gender equality and women empowerment. And that's where the leadership is, and that's where the partnership is for Canada to partner with, allies and the countries that share the same vision and the same values. And that's also a challenge in itself. So, and again, how do you start the partnerships? Canada has a wealth of experience. Canadian organizations have been working, for decades in developing countries, in middle-income countries, in least developed countries, and have a wealth of experience and, lessons that we can draw on so that we can move forward now. And some of these consultations are actually already taking place. I belong to the Canadian Association for International Development Professionals, and we're having a conference and a dialogue with the Global Affairs Canada. The topic of this conference is, the rollout of the feminist international aid policy and engaging with Canadian international development practitioners, professionals, those who have the expertise to bring, the evidence-based an information framework to policies that we want to implement. The conference is going to take place in January 22nd, 23rd in Ottawa, and you're all invited to also join the discussion on how Canada can really pursue this very ambitious and leadership in this international aid policy.
You're all invited, another conference. Want to get to the other side of the country? January, Ottawa.
If you like ski, you should be there.
I'm going to try and draw you both out, actually, on this discussion around gender and the empowerment of women in particular, because it is an example, I think, of where a partnership is both critical and also can be problematic. And that's the case because not every country, as you've just said, ELISSAR, not every country shares the same views about the role of women. I think there is a consensus in the development community that working with women and girls is going to be how you succeed more quickly in achieving particularly community development at the local level. Doug and I actually were on the board of CARE Canada together, and CARE, as many other Canadian development organizations, as you've just said, has taken the empowerment of women and girls as the key leverage point for the work that they do in communities across the world. And I think that would be true in Canada as well. There's no reason why we wouldn't be applying the same thinking around community and how you lead community development. You know, if it's good enough for a community in Africa, it's certainly going to be true of a community in Canada that is also looking for ways to engage in citizen-led development. We'll actually be having a discussion about that tomorrow as part of the ongoing think tank track around this. But let me just draw you both out on this. There clearly are potential conflicts in countries that have different cultural beliefs and values around the role of women. And if you're engaging in partnership and you are trying to move forward together, what happens when you have conflicts of that kind, of culture, of belief, of values? You know, Canada is trying to lead, but what happens when you run into these kinds of conflicts? Doug, do you want to try and address that?
Sure, I can relate to the question a bit. It brings to mind an experience I had at a mine called Antamina in northern Peru in the high Andes in the second range. And one of the local communities was a town called San Marco, and we would go visit it periodically. We had programs going on there, agriculture and otherwise. And I remember one conversation with what would be classed in our Indigenous community as an elder, a fellow. And in the course of a long conversation, one thing he told me stuck. He said, if you give money to the men in our village, it goes on beer and brothels. But if you help the women, it generates family values and improves the lot of the young and inspires education. And that particular observation from that gentleman has been repeated over and over and over again in my history. When we were with the Zinc and Health program, I can remember meetings in Nepal, and all of the discussion, the activity, the initiatives around the zinc supplementation program, but also around a lot of the other economic activity that was occurring in all the villages we went to, was centered around the women's groups. They exist. I found them in Senegal, found them in Burkina Faso, found them in Ethiopia. A different name all over the place, but it seems to be ubiquitous that's where the center of discussion is going to occur, around things that do the most for community betterment. So it just seems to me relatively obvious that organizations like CARE and companies like ours have to focus in that direction. Secondly, more at a corporate level, there's an increasing tendency, and certainly I understand it in Teck, to develop diversity policies aimed at gender equality and gender diversity. And there's a self-interest motive, and that's because half the potential workforce out there is women. And a big effort to get more women into Elk Valley in the region that you heard about from Chief Pierre today, the Tunaha, through our agreements with the Tunaha, between Teck and the Tunaha, but also on Teck's own ground, working very hard to try and make the business that we're in more attractive to women at all levels, not just at senior management levels or communications or whatever, but driving trucks and monkey wrenching those same vehicles. And lastly, a program that we've engaged with the United Nations called UN Women, which is aimed at helping women in northern Chile develop the skills, capability, and interest to take part in the mining sector, which is virtually their entire economy in that part of the country. And it's really important. I mean, if you look at things like artisanal small mining, where it's what is normally called illegal because it's people ferreting out gold on the side of a riverbank and dumping mercury in as a consequence when they use it. The women are even excluded from that kind of activity in a lot of these countries, and you find them out picking through rocks on talus slopes of old mines. We're trying to empower those women, educate them on what the problems are when they're dealing with leftover mercury from the male workers that were in there before, so that they can carry the economic burden and as well as the opportunities to their kids. It's no matter what strata of society you look, you find that's an important and continuing element that we have to put more attention to.
ELISSA?
A couple of comments. I just want to add to what Doc just said, is that the United Nations, the different agencies have really in the last decade or so under the UN Global Compact have brought in corporations and businesses to support programs in women empowerment and gender equality, in addition to other programs as well. But specifically UN Women have been really drawing on resources from the different sources, from big business corporations, from philanthropy, public-private partnerships has become, a very solid component of how resources are raised to support all the programs for women empowerment, economic or political participation, or environmental, programs to try, as Doc said, to try to really build the capacity of women who really always get the brunt of, these policies. On the how do we handle the tension or the different of cultural values, and what we to support women or to adopt an approach of women empowerment and gender equality is really to support women organizations and women to try to really advance an agenda that they to make a difference to their society and to make a difference in their lives. So you let them drive the agenda. That will achieve gender equality and women and empowerment as women to be active citizens, to have voice in the policy process, to be able to run for elections. So let them drive the change process. Let me give you an example. Canada's always supported women empowerment, whether directly or through the UN. And I was, part of many of the programs when I was at UNDP. We received funding from Canada for those programs. One example is that the support to women in Jordan and in Lebanon. In Jordan was to try to empower women to try to put pressure on the parliament to change some laws, family laws. And one particular one that I'm sure most of you are familiar with is the I forgot what it's called.
Is it in Jordan?
It is in Jordan. It's the honor crimes, sorry. Oh, okay. The honor crimes. There was a law that the pressure from women's group, it took a decade for the law to change, but at the end it did, because women were, had the resources to exercise the pressure, and they were very adamant, and eventually the law was changed. Same thing in Lebanon. In Lebanon, there's been a lot of women organization to change the laws on sexual assault on women in Lebanon, and I think it was 2-3 months ago that already changed, but it took years for them to be able to achieve that goal. So change in governance reforms is it takes time. It takes patience. I mean, if you want to support, in this instance, women empowerment, you need to be consistent in empowering women to drive their own reform agenda.
I do want to leave time. We have time for questions. We have about another 20 minutes or so. So I think there are microphones. Am I right, organizers? Yes. So there are microphones down here, or maybe it's a small enough group that we can, even though you're spread out there, that you could actually stand up and articulate your question so that everybody could hear. You can also repeat it if necessary. So while you're thinking about it, and making your way to a microphone.
There's a couple out there.
Oh, yeah, you can see better than I can.
You can't see through the lights, so
I
yell.
know, it's very difficult. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yes, please. Yes, right. I'll repeat if necessary.
Doug HORSWILL, my name is Hugh Stevens. So Doug, your example you gave us at the Red Dog Mine, I think it's called in Alaska. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
I can, Hugh.
Yep.
The Red Dog Mine in Alaska sounds like it was a kind of model of best practice, transfer of resources to the native community, ongoing employment, etc. I wasn't at the opening session, so I don't know if you talked about examples in Canada, but are there examples like that in Canada? I mean, I don't necessarily mean through Teck, but I mean through others, because
Yeah.
we hear a lot about the Ring of Fire and all this problem. But I'm not aware of any that are that successful. I'm wondering if one of the reasons is because of the way the native corporations are set up in Alaska. Is it easier to deal in an Alaskan context than with the various structures that we have in Canada? Or perhaps there are examples in Canada that I'm not aware of, so maybe you could talk a bit about those.
Okay. I'll pick your question apart. I think most people heard it. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement set up 13 village corporations, and it created a profit motive within those corporations. They had two choices: tribal or the corporate model at the time that this was all being debated in the United States. And it was at the time that they were clearing the way to build the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And they chose the corporate model. And I believe, based on my experience, that the corporate model has, in fact, been more successful in returning benefits to people. This based on the way it's focused and so on. But there's also a very different political environment in the United States and in Alaska, so you have to take that into account. The one key element that led to the success of Red Dog relative to other partnerships around North America and to some degree around the world is that when the Alaska Native Claims Settlement occurred and NANA ground was there available for its choosing, it was able, as is the case in Canada, to pick what they called A lands. A lands were lands on which they held the mineral title. So the power balance was different than in a case in Canada where a provincial government issues the mineral rights to the mining company, and then the mining company needs to develop its own social license. In this case, they held title, and that gave them the bargaining leverage. I think the same outcome could have happened if the right enlightenment had among the corporate side was there for it, and I think it is now. Today in Canada, I go back to my own experience. When we were looking at something called Kudzdakaya, which is in southern Yukon, in the territory of the Ross River Dana, we started off by engaging the community. We sat with them, we developed relationships, and we in effect handed them the power over us. We said, you can control when we work, how we work, what we do, and generally even the territory on which we can actually operate. And a lot of companies, I think, are doing that, or increasingly. Some aren't. Clearly, it's not a perfect world. But if you go into northern Saskatchewan, into the uranium fields, you'll find very strong relationships. They're business-based, usually needs-based entrepreneurship, as well as organizational entrepreneurship, where these kinds of relationships are set up. It's not quite the same because there isn't a royalty flow unless the province has got involved and created that royalty flow. But there are a lot of other benefits. In Nunavut, where there's title held, there will be relationships like the ones in Red Dog if there's discoveries that go along with it. I don't know much about the Ring of Fire. I think there's been some mistakes made there. We'll see what happens. In the Northwest Territories around the diamond mines, very strong agreements. And in fact, the government of Canada, in the environmental approvals at that time, required benefit agreements to be signed with the 4 Aboriginal groups in the area of Diavik and Ekati. When I was out on the rock out in Newfoundland dealing with the Innu and the Inuit over the Voisey's Bay discovery, again, we were very much looking to enable them to create relationships with that mining development that would bring the benefits to the community that were needed. And as you do that, it's back to the inclusive governance side that Lyra was talking about. You gain because you understand the precepts of the community and you operate in a manner that respects that interest. And so everybody comes out better for doing it.
That's great. Anyone else? Oh yeah, I see some hands. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Yep.
My name is Zanabas, and I'm a student at Norah University of International Business and Sustainability. And my question to the panel is, we see that sustainability as an industry is growing, and we see people caring about not just profit maximization, but also the society or the community or the businesses that they're operating in and the environment as a whole. But again, when you look at these businesses or look at today's world, we see the core focus is still profit maximization, whereas we see there's a business case for sustainability. So how do we make sustainability mainstream, and how do we make it to appeal to the common masses, not just to a niche market, not just to a green consumer? So how do we approach that?
Big question, limited time to answer. Doug, again, I think.
Okay, I'll take the first crack at that. First of all, the term profit maximization is brought up often as a pejorative and sometimes misunderstood. There's the dimension that's misunderstood is time. If a company is listening to an analyst from Bay Street and Wall Street, they're a small entity just trying to build a business, whether it's in the resource sector or anything else, they're paying attention to their quarterly results, bang, 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 as if it was all-encompassing. If a company is past that and is self-sustaining, they're much more interested in the long run. And if they're interested in the long run, then they've got to see what kind of business actually maximizes the value of my company or my profit. It's not just price and cost, but it's the capability of accessing resources in the future, the reputation, the ability to hire. I mean, Teck today, as a mining company, would have a great deal of difficulty recruiting new engineers if it didn't have a strong reputation as a company committed to sustainability and the broad-based goals, not just the three, but taking the environment apart and putting it into its place. And if you look in any information about that company or about a lot of the other major companies in the business, you'll find that it's real. The commitments are real, and they're real because people won't work for them if they're not. In my sector, I can't speak for some of the technology sectors or the retail sectors, but I think it's probably somewhat the same. So in that sense, the generational change that's occurring is helping to make it mainstream. It's just, you take a value structure that's within that frame of that company from history, but it's continually evolving by the new blood that's coming in at the bottom and changing the dynamics, and it's real.
So there was some hand behind,
can I just
and
add
then
a comment to
oh,
it,
of course,
please?
Elisar, sorry, yeah, and then we'll to you.
Just on the concept of sustainable, I mean, the concept came from the first Rio conference on the environment, where the sustainable development, basically the policies and the programs that we do today will not harm the environment for the generations to come. So that concept came from that conference, but it has been now adopted as a mainstream concept to denote the notion that the policies and the programs that we adopt are going to have a long-term, as Doug said, long-term results without, causing harm to the environment, to the, any economic dividends, etc. So the Sustainable Development Goals adopted that concept to note that the development that the course of development is going to take place and the goals we're going to achieve are sustainable over time. You know, there's not a short term that, so that concept has been mainstream in all policy areas, you know, adopting from the environment and now in businesses and in other education and health and all the other areas of development.
If I could just add one other thing. I think a crucial element in the future of mainstreaming this even more is to ensure that agendas, that curricula in universities and high schools are properly adapted. MBA students should learn a lot more about empathy and what it means than they used to. And I think that's probably happening. I don't know if it's happening in engineering schools, but it should. There should be a lot more emphasis on value-based learning.
Well, that's another whole topic, isn't it? Yes.
Thank you. And thank you very much for the information you're sharing. My name is Colleen Hanley. I'm the president of CHAR, the Society for Intercultural Education, Training, and Research here in British Columbia. It's an international organization. I was particularly interested in the comments about the tools.
We have a microphone. That's great. If you want to, do you want to try and, yeah, that'd be great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'm particularly interested in your comment about the tools one would use when you're working to build a successful project that is inclusive. You talked about mutual respect, you talked about trust, and you talked about transparent ways of solving problems. And I'd ask this question of both of you. When you're working across cultures, where even the word problem may be a culturally bound word, I'm interested in what strategies, what ways of thinking that you use to help you try to be transparent in solving problems, given that that might be a very Western, culturally bound concept.
Great question, thanks. ELISSAR, do you want to start?
I want to understand that I understood the question very well first. You're asking in applying transparent tools with the partners, how do we ensure that, sorry, I didn't really understand exactly what you meant. You know, what is the question?
So what I'm thinking of is if you're working on a development project,
yes.
perhaps in a mine in sub-Saharan Africa,
yeah.
and it's a collectivist culture, and it's a business that's based in a North American individualistic frame of reference, and that culture may even not use the
Clashes of
No, I
beliefs.
understand what you mean.
the concept of problem. How do you create a transparent solution when how you even define what's going on might be different?
Okay. Usually in the work that, and I'm talking now, within, the UN framework, UNDP, the work how we work with the partners is that any project that is going to be developed, we involve different stakeholders in society in a consultative process. So there was no project that was designed, there was no plan that was put in place without consultation with the different stakeholders, be it civil society, NGOs, representatives from governments or academia. All stakeholders in that society were in the first, we call it inception work plan, that everybody's around the table and the project that needs to be developed is discussed so that there is, first is identified by national actors, and the results and the plans are guided by the priorities they have defined, and the results will be measured according to what makes impact in their society. So it wasn't a driven process that we try to really tell them or impose or kind of, design the program for them. We would help them in terms of making the resources available, the tools, the information, the data, the best practices, to look at other examples and then have them craft the model that would work for them. And that's the transparent relation that we had, and the UNDP have offices all over the world, and that's the model that's implemented globally. So there wasn't really a program that we would come and say, this would work for you. the programs were developed in partnership with the national actors, be it different levels of government or civil society.
Doug?
There's no good, perfect answer to that, and I think that the process continues to evolve. I think the optimism is that I think the people making those decisions around those projects are learning and understanding that they need that understanding, and they're starting to realize what they don't know. Times past, if you got blessing from a central government or a provincial government, whatever it would be, the thing would just bowl ahead. It was sort of like the Chinese building the Three Gorges Dam. You move 2 million people because they're in the way. That era, I think, is past. The issue of listening, but listening ethically and learning is critical. Hiring people who would understand the particular culture that you're involved in and listening to them, having some patience and taking some time. One of the big challenges comes if a decision is made to proceed with a project, and it's a $2 billion project, then money starts to flow. And as soon as money starts to flow, time becomes important. And also the actors change. Instead of the principal company, now you've got contractors and various other competing entities or cooperating entities involved. And it gets harder and harder to try and maintain discipline and make sure that commitments made are commitments kept. But companies have to find a way to do that, I think, just like governments do on infrastructure projects or anything else. And the notion, again, it goes back to this idea of inclusivity and making sure that the voices of the most impacted and often least powerful are listened to and taken into account.
Mm-hmm. We have time for one more question, I think, and then we're going to wrap up with some comments. Brittany, I think you had a, yeah, okay. Do we have the, there's the microphone, yeah.
Hi there. I'm Dr. Brittany Harker-Martin. I'm here as a professor of leadership policy and governance from the University of Calgary. Hello. And I'd actually like to return to the conversation about gender equality in the workplace. And I come to this as a mother of two professional, having watched my opportunities and those of my peers slowly suffocated by the heavy load of being a working mother. And I know that there was a poll in Calgary not too long ago that said 70% of the caregiving in the city of Calgary actually falls to women still in this day and age. And when we talk about what that looks like in terms of career opportunities for smart, engaged, powerful women who are still undertaking all of these duties that go well beyond taking out the garbage and buying groceries, you know, we're talking about who fills out the field trip forms, who fills out the school supplies, who takes the kids to the doctor during the workday, who does the dentist, who goes to the optometrist, who, you know, there's a toll that it takes on your career if you're the one who's always needing to slip away. And what happens is then you lose the opportunity to be the one at the table at the 6 a.m. meeting because you're getting the kids to school. And you lose the opportunity to have those after work dialogues because you had to leave early. So in disrupting this dialogue about gender equality, I'm wondering, do you really think society is ready to look at where the caregiving is taking place and see that having children is not an unprofessional thing, but should be a gender-shared responsibility in a way that is supported by corporations? And if you do think that, where have you seen it happening? Because so far I haven't.
Okay, so I did mention that we had like 1 minute left for an answer. Yeah. I'll ask Doug and ELISSAR to try very short answer, and I'm really sorry because this is a big question that I think deserves a whole hour just to itself. You know, it's very important, and I don't want to give it short shrift. But ELISSAR and Doug, and then I'm going to ask you perhaps at the same time if you could give us a couple of closing thoughts on partnerships and power imbalances and gender inequality, and just in a couple of minutes.
Which order? Do you want me to go first?
You
I can go
answer the
first.
question, and you know.
I can go first. I will have more time.
Are we going to get like 5 more minutes from the organizers? Thank you. Yes? Okay. Oh, Timmy says, okay.
I mean, are we ready? I mean, that's a question. If you look at now versus our mothers versus our daughters, it is changing over time. And there isn't really a perfect time that you can address this. It has to evolve over time, and it has been. It's not as quick as we'd like it, but it is evolving. And there's a lot of work about addressing, what women, in the women at work, the division of labor and all that, and how they are deprived of access to, opportunities in the workforce and all that. That's a whole, program of work that has already been addressed, and there's a lot of work. And internationally and in Canada, it's been worked on, but, this is a discussion, a whole conference, that we can discuss that. But just briefly to say, is the time ready? I mean, there's no the right time to address this, and it's been happening, and the change will come over time. Definitely, I did much better than my mother, and your daughters are going to do much better than you and I did. But I mean, it's time bound, I think. Closing remarks, I just want to go back to the issue of partnerships and how important at this point of time that, partnerships with different, segments of societies, with different partners, whether within Canada or outside Canada, at different levels in order to really try to push a very ambitious and value, underlined agenda that's not going to be easy to achieve. And it would need a lot of partnership and commitment and leadership to make it really happen.
Thank you. Doug.
I wish I had an answer for your question. I mean, obviously, in some ways, you weren't looking for a specific answer because it's such a major question. I mean, my daughter-in-law shares exactly your perspective over our grandchildren. I think companies are recognizing that flexibility is needed. The ship changes direction slowly. The notion that everybody has to be at work every hour of the day, it's passé, but it's nonetheless there, especially in kind of the major companies. Probably if you're in marketing or something and everybody's spread all over the world, it's a very different business. But not in those. And a company that doesn't recognize it and doesn't try and figure out how to change its workplace to accommodate women and childbearing and all is going to lose in the end. I mean, there's more women in university than men today, right? And in so many other ways. It bodes for an interesting societal change. In terms of my closing remarks, so that's as far as I can get with that. I hearken back to Prime Minister Martin's comments yesterday about 10 million youth born a year by 1935 in Africa and 3 million jobs. Inclusivity, partnerships, development, it's absolutely crucial that we find ways to deal with poverty reduction and human improvement in places where people are, or their migration, which would be absolutely unstoppable, will overwhelm the so-called rich parts of the world. And it is a collective problem. We've all got to get together to address it. Every idea counts. And I mean, there's clearly been an evolution in thinking. I talked about a little bit of that in my microcosm of a world. I think it's happening much more broadly. It needs to continue. And one way or another, we solve the problem, or at our peril, we don't. And that wouldn't be very good. So.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank our two panelists, and I appreciate the time you've taken. I did want to close myself with a reference back to the words that I think we've now heard several times over the course of the sort of last 24 hours. I think partnerships at the end of the day are about respect and also about giving each partner the dignity that, that they deserve, the recognition of their dignity. I think those are the most successful partnerships. Very hard to do. We haven't resolved any of the issues of power that we've talked about earlier. I mean, I think this is one of these ongoing and huge conversations, but the importance of recognizing that these are questions and that that both dignity and respect have got to be sort of the guiding principles of our thinking about partnership going forward. I feel encouraged by that recognition. I do think that there are more stories of that recognition now than there were even a decade ago. And I think ELISSAR and Doug have both given us evidence of that. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for being here. Come and participate in one of our track discussions tomorrow in the think tanks. And thank you again for your attention.
Thank you, Hilary. Thank you to the panel. That's certainly lots of food for thought and food for discussion over the 20-minute break we have ahead of us before we tackle the two last big issues of the day, if not the century or the millennium: global change and climate justice, and global trade and inclusion. Thank you very much. We'll see you at 2 to 3 o'clock.